A British teenager who joined ISIS in Syria is begging the United Kingdom to let her come home. Shamima Begum was one of 3 schoolgirls living in London's Bethnal Green neighborhood who joined the terror group back in 2015. She left London and married an ISIS fighter in Syria. And she recently spoke to Sky News shortly after giving birth to a baby boy in a refugee camp. She says she has no regrets.
I think a lot of people should have sympathy towards me for everything I've been through. You know, when I didn't know what I was getting into when I left, and I just was hoping that maybe for the sake of me and my child, they let me come back. I never did anything dangerous. I never made propaganda. I never encouraged people to come to Syria, so they don't really have proof that I did anything that is dangerous.
CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams is following this story from London. So, Holly, this story has really captivated much of the UK and sort of everywhere worldwide. What more can you tell us about Shamima and how exactly she ended up in Syria?
Yeah, well, Vlad, Shamima Begum was 15 years old when she ran away from her home in East London with 2 of her school friends to join ISIS in Syria. This was in early 2015 when they left. It caused a media sensation at the time. People were absolutely horrified. And the timing is really important. This was early 2015, so it was shortly after ISIS had gone on the rampage across northern Iraq, carrying out mass executions, kidnapping women as sex slaves, and in Syria, carrying out very brutal executions of American journalists and gleefully publishing those beheading videos on the internet. So that was the group that these girls went off to join in Syria. After they left, not much was heard of them. It's been reported that one of those girls was killed in an airstrike. We haven't been able to confirm that. But then last week, Shamima Begum was tracked down in a refugee camp in eastern Syria, apparently having just emerged from ISIS territory by a British journalist. And since then, she's been interviewed by 2 more British journalists. She is now 19 years old. She's married to an ISIS militant. And initially, she was very heavily pregnant. She's since had her baby. And she says she deserves sympathy. She wants sympathy. And more importantly, she wants to come home to Britain. She is a British citizen. The problem for her, though, is that she is not striking a very remorseful tone in any of those interviews. In one of them, she actually said she had no regrets about joining ISIS. In one of the interviews, she described seeing the severed heads of people who had been executed by ISIS, and she described herself as being unfazed by that. And in the most recent interview with BBC News, she was asked about the attack, the terrorist attack on the Manchester Arena back in 2017. That was an Ariana Grande concert, I'm sure you remember it, in which 23 people died, many of them young girls. And she said on the one hand, well, that was wrong, but then on the other hand, she said, it's a two-way thing, really. I'm quoting her verbatim here. It's a two-way thing, really. Women and children are being killed in the Islamic State, and this is a kind of retaliation, so I thought that is a fair justification. So you can imagine, it's at best an ambiguous tone. You can imagine how that's gone down with the British public and the British media. Just to give you a flavour of that, these are some of the headlines in the British newspapers over the today's headlines, actually. This is her showing me some sympathy. They're quoting her, jihadi bride, I had a good time. And then most explicitly, these are tabloid newspapers, most explicitly of all, sympathy, you must be kidding.
Yeah, so that's, as you say, this has sparked a major debate over in the United Kingdom about whether or not she deserves any sympathy. But more importantly, I guess legally speaking, under the law, a British citizen can return home. Of course, though, the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, has said that he would have issues with letting her come back. But under the law, technically, she can.
It's a slightly messy issue. If she were in a country where Britain had a consular presence, where it had diplomats, Britain would very likely be forced to take her back. She is, after all, a British citizen. Certainly if she arrived back in Britain, they would be forced to take her back. However, this is in Syria. She's in a Syrian refugee camp. There is no British consular presence there. And so it would require the British government to contact the people who are holding her and stage some kind of operation to bring her home. And as you said, the British Home Secretary, Sajid Javid has made it pretty clear that he doesn't want to do that. And the British government is not alone. There are around 800 foreign ISIS fighters being held by America's Syrian allies in eastern Syria, as well as hundreds of ISIS wives and children, and many European countries simply do not want to bring them back. The US, who has had to deal with just a few of its nationals being captured in Syria, has brought them home, and there is frustration on the part of the US government over this. And in fact, on Sunday, President Trump tweeted about his frustration, demanding that European governments take their nationals home and saying, if they don't, we will be forced to release them. That seems fairly unlikely, but it's a good indication, I think, of the frustration and consternation on the part of the US government about what to do with these foreign ISIS fighters.
Holly, let's talk a little bit about Syria briefly from a military and political standpoint. Just a few days ago, less than a week ago, I think, the President of the United States, President Trump, said that in a week, ISIS would be 100% defeated. All this comes against the backdrop of Kurdish forces that are closing in on that one remaining ISIS territory in Syria. What is the latest right now in the coalition's fight against them?
Yeah, as we understand it, there are now just a few hundred ISIS fighters left in a very small patch of territory, just a few hundred square metres, as we understand it, holed up in a camp there. So ISIS is on the brink of losing the last tiny scrap of its territory in Syria. But I think it's really important, Vlad, to understand that this does not spell the end of ISIS. And we are already seeing ISIS reinvent itself in Syria and Iraq as an insurgent group that is carrying out terrorist attacks in the lands that it once controlled.
Really important reporting there. Holly Williams, thank you so much for providing that context. We appreciate it. We appreciate it.